Imagine pouring your life savings into the dream you've chased for decades, only to have it stolen right out from under you while you're hundreds of miles away. My name is Frank Miller, and for as long as I can remember, I wanted land I could call my own. After 35 years working as a mechanical engineer in the oil industry, I finally made that dream real. 5 acres just outside Austin, Texas, with a white farmhouse that looked like it belonged on a postcard, fields perfect for specialty crops, and a sturdy red barn that reminded me of my grandfather's old farm. Every morning, before the sun broke the horizon, I'd pull on my overalls and cowboy hat, breathe in that crisp country air, and get to work. This place wasn't just property. It was my sanctuary. My hands in the soil, the cluck of heritage chickens in the background, the scent of dew on growing crops, it was the life I had worked for, sacrificed for, and cherished. My daughter, Sarah, made that dream even brighter. At 26, she had just finished her graduate degree in agricultural law and moved back home, ready to help modernize the farm and build on what I'd started. Seeing her enthusiasm, the same spark in her eyes that I'd once felt, gave me hope that the legacy I was building would carry on for generations. Together, we had plans: rotating seasonal crops, direct-to-market sales, farm-to-table events. The community respected us, or so I thought. Then there was Victoria Caldwell. Some people around here call her a force of nature. I called her a hurricane in designer heels. She moved in from California about 5 years after I bought my farm, bringing with her big city arrogance and a vision for elevating our quiet rural community into something she could brag about to her old friends. The moment she took charge of the newly formed HOA, trouble followed. Ridiculous complaints about my tractor being visible from the road. Violation notices for the crow of my roosters. She even claimed the color of my barn, a classic rustic red, clashed with the modern aesthetic she wanted to force on the neighborhood. Each ticket arrived with that smug little smile of hers, thinly veiled attempts to drive me out and pave the way for overpriced developments. But I didn't give in. I fought back at every meeting, every hearing, every email. I thought I had seen the worst of Victoria's schemes. I was wrong. Sarah had been after me for years to take a real break. One evening, as we finished feeding the chickens and locking up the barn, she dusted off her jeans and looked at me with that determined gleam I couldn't say no to. "Dad, when was the last time you took more than a day off?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She was right. For as long as we'd had this farm, I hadn't taken more than a weekend, and even then, my mind was always half here. So, together, we planned it, a 2-week father-daughter trip to the Grand Canyon, something I'd promised her back when she was just a kid riding on the tractor with me, asking about the big red rocks and starry skies. We prepared meticulously. I had our neighbor Sam, someone I trusted like family, agree to keep an eye on the place. Mike, a hard-working local farmhand who'd been with us through harvest seasons, would check in on the animals 3 times a week. Sarah made detailed instructions for feed schedules, irrigation systems, and even what to do if one of the hens looked off. I installed brand new security cameras with remote access, ensuring we could check in from anywhere. The night before we left, just as the sky was turning dark, Victoria's black Lexus slowed to a crawl at the end of our driveway. Her window rolled down, and there she was, smile painted on tight like it might crack if it moved too much. "Heading somewhere, Frank? Don't worry. The community will look after your place." Her tone was light, but her eyes carried that glint of something I couldn't quite place. I waved it off at the time. I was too focused on the trip, on finally making good on that promise to Sarah. But later, I'd replay that moment over and wonder why I didn't listen to the warning in my gut. While Sarah and I marveled at canyons carved by time itself and took photos with silly hats and ice cream cones, back home, Victoria was setting her plan into motion. At the last HOA meeting, one I missed because we were knee-deep in trip preparations, she had added a last-minute agenda item. Buried under lines of legal jargon was something called the Community Property Utilization Program. It sounded harmless, maybe even helpful. But in private executive notes, our farm was listed as the pilot property. The language was vague on purpose, crafted so that only someone like Victoria could twist it into authorization to take what wasn't hers. The scheme was elegant in its deception. While we snapped selfies and stood on cliff edges, Victoria's moving trucks rolled up our long gravel driveway. Professional decorators followed, carrying in armfuls of new furniture, staging props, and plastic farmhouse decor. Victoria herself hosted a private cocktail party in our living room, right beneath where our family photos once hung. She toasted to modernizing rustic assets, her code for gutting homes like mine and turning them into revenue machines. But that wasn't the worst of it. She didn't stop at our farm. Documents we would later find showed that 3 other neighbors, elderly folks and young couples alike, had been targeted. Victoria had been issuing endless violations to these homeowners, forcing down their property values and buying them out through a shell company she secretly controlled. My friend and neighbor Mr. Leonard, who'd lived on his small plot longer than anyone, had been pushed out only months before. I remembered his tired eyes when he said goodbye, never knowing the full extent of the betrayal he had suffered. On the 11th day of our trip, just as Sarah and I were sitting down to dinner in a cozy lodge, my phone buzzed. It was Sam. His voice was low, strained. "Frank, something strange is going on at your place. There are people moving in and out, strangers. They're saying they rented the farm. They even showed me confirmation emails from something called Hillside Estates Experiences." My stomach dropped. Sarah looked at me, eyes wide with concern. I ended the call, opened the airport app on my phone, and booked the earliest flight home. Neither of us spoke as we packed, our minds racing with questions and dread. We boarded that plane the next morning, anxiety pressing down on us with every passing minute. Sarah scrolled through her phone, her fingers flying over the screen, searching for any trace of what was happening at home. Her face went pale as she found it, an Airbnb listing with bright, polished photos of our home, described as a charming authentic farm retreat managed by Hillside Estates HOA. The price? $450 a night. I sat there in silence, gripping the armrest, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deep in my bones. The woman who had spent years trying to push us out had found her opportunity. And she had taken it with both hands. The drive home from the airport felt longer than any road trip I'd ever taken. Each mile closer, the tension grew tighter in my chest. Sarah sat beside me, her eyes locked on her phone, flipping between the Airbnb listing and legal statutes, her lips pressed into a thin line. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, thick with dread and disbelief. When we finally turned down our gravel driveway, my heart sank. A sleek rental car sat where my old John Deere tractor usually rested. The porch, my porch, was occupied by unfamiliar faces, sipping drinks and laughing like they belonged there. My barn doors were wide open, bright signage advertising farm experiences fluttered in the breeze. And there, in the center of it all, stood Victoria Caldwell in her tailored navy blue suit, gesturing with clipped precision as she directed 2 men carrying boxes into my house. Her composure faltered for only a heartbeat when she spotted our truck. I cut the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. We stepped out slowly, still wearing the casual clothes from our trip, the Arizona dust clinging to our boots. Victoria's plastic smile returned, but her eyes flickered with panic before hardening into arrogance. "Frank. Sarah. What a surprise." She recovered quickly, her voice syrupy sweet. "We were just discussing the wonderful farm experience your property is providing for our guests." Guests. The word echoed in my mind like a bad joke. Before I could respond, a woman in yoga pants and oversized sunglasses approached us, confusion written all over her face. "I'm Melissa Jenkins," she said, clutching her phone. "We rented this property through Airbnb, over $2,000 for the week." Her voice cracked, and she showed me the confirmation email, listing Victoria Caldwell as property manager. I felt the blood drain from my face. Sarah, already pulling out her phone, found the listing within seconds. The pictures were glossy, staged to perfection, showcasing our home as some kind of rustic fantasy retreat. Every detail had been carefully curated, every room, every corner of the barn. All for sale. I turned back to Victoria, my voice low but shaking with fury. "This is our home." Her smile never wavered as she slipped a neatly printed document from her designer bag. Under the recently approved Community Utilization Program, the HOA has full authority to manage underutilized properties for community benefit during extended owner absences, she recited as if reading from a script. "It's all perfectly legal, Frank." My vision blurred. I took a step toward her, my fists clenched. "You broke into our home. You moved our belongings. You rented it out like it was a timeshare. That's breaking and entering, theft, fraud." Her smug expression didn't crack. "Your signature on the deed acceptance includes agreement to all current and future HOA regulations." Sarah's voice, steady and razor-sharp, cut through the moment. "I'm an agricultural attorney, Ms. Caldwell. No HOA bylaw supersedes state property law. What you've done here is criminal." Victoria's lips twitched, but she said nothing. Melissa looked horrified. "I just wanted my kids to experience farm life," she whispered, her eyes darting between us and Victoria. "It's not your fault," I told her softly, though my gaze never left the woman who had invaded every corner of my life. "You're just another victim." I stepped into my house, bracing for what I might find, but nothing could have prepared me. The entry hall where generations of family photos had once lined the walls now held mass-produced, country-chic artwork. Our living room was stripped of its worn but cherished furniture, replaced by matching faux rustic sets. A laminated welcome binder sat on the coffee table, boasting add-on farm experiences with prices listed like a resort menu. Sarah's voice called from the kitchen, hollow and strained. "Dad, they replaced everything. Our family dishes, gone." She held up a mug reading "Rise and Shine on the Farm." I pushed open the door to my workshop, only to find a pool table and shelves of board games where my tools and equipment, worth over $40,000, should have been. I staggered back, rage and heartbreak crashing over me in equal measure. Sarah's room was next, her thesis research, journals, and childhood keepsakes boxed up and shoved into a corner, some water-damaged, others defaced with cruel, mocking comments written in red pen. My blood boiled. In the barn, handwritten signs advertised egg-collecting lessons for $25 and tractor rides for $40. I sank onto a hay bale, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deep in my bones. Sarah sat beside me, showing me the Airbnb calendar, fully booked for the next 3 months. They were planning to cycle 28 different groups of strangers through our home, turning our life's work into their private cash cow. And they thought they'd get away with it. That night, neither Sarah nor I slept. We sat at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, though it hardly felt like ours anymore, surrounded by the hollow echoes of what had once been a home filled with warmth and history. Instead, we found ourselves in a staged photo set for someone else's profit. But beneath the grief and anger, something else stirred: resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sarah took the lead, her legal training shining through every calm, measured word. We started by gathering hard evidence. She photographed every corner of the house, noting changes, damages, and missing items. I documented the absence of my tools and equipment, listing serial numbers and replacement values from receipts I'd kept meticulously over the years. The total was staggering, more than $42,000 in stolen property. We moved to the office, or what was now labeled the farm planning room. Among the staged antique decor, I found a drawer stuffed with hastily filed papers. Inside, there was a folder marked Confidential, HOA Executive Meeting Minutes. I read each line slowly, the bile rising in my throat. Victoria's scheme had been far larger than we imagined. The rental operation wasn't just about our property, it was part of a strategy to cover a $135,000 shortfall created by her disastrous and unauthorized community center project. The kicker? That so-called community center turned out to be a private spa and event venue in her own backyard, masquerading as an HOA-funded project. But there was more, pages outlining what they chillingly called resistance management. It included instructions on offering minimal hush money to homeowners who objected and, if that failed, threatening drawn-out legal battles to drain their resources. They had anticipated we might object. They just never anticipated we'd fight back. Sarah looked up from her laptop, her eyes flashing with something fierce. "Dad, look at this." She turned the screen to me, displaying public disciplinary records from the California Bar Association. Victoria Caldwell didn't even exist, not originally. Her real name was Victoria Mercer. She'd been disbarred 5 years ago for property management fraud and financial misappropriation in nearly identical schemes. She changed her name, moved to Texas, and started all over again. I exhaled slowly. They thought they were dealing with a simple farmer. But I had spent 12 years on the Texas State Agricultural Board before retirement. I knew the laws she was breaking, and I still had friends who enforced them. It was time to make calls. My first was to James Wilson at the State Comptroller's office. "James, it's Frank Miller. I've got a situation you're going to want to hear about." He didn't need convincing. Within 20 minutes, he had opened a formal tax evasion investigation into unregistered hotel operations. My next call went to Maria Gonzalez at the State Agricultural Commission. "Maria, I've found a serious violation of agricultural land use, unauthorized commercial activity, animal handling without proper licenses, you name it." Maria promised to dispatch investigators within 48 hours. Meanwhile, Sarah worked every connection she had from law school. One of her colleagues at the Texas Real Estate Commission confirmed that Victoria was also operating as an unlicensed property manager, a serious offense. My accountant, Frank Perkins, spent the entire night itemizing damages and calculating projected lost income. What they'd done was more than illegal, it bordered on criminal enterprise. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. Sam knocked on our door just after sunrise, his face drawn with guilt. "Frank, I'm so sorry. I should have known something was off." He pulled out his phone and showed us photos he'd taken from across the fence line while Victoria's crew had been moving in furniture and changing the locks. In one photo, clear as day, Victoria was directing workers, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her head, the very picture of smug confidence. But the most damning evidence of all was in another image, a forged document bearing my signature. Sarah compared it to samples of my handwriting and immediately noticed discrepancies, especially the loop in the F, something I never did. It was enough to prove forgery beyond doubt. By late afternoon, we had compiled everything: photographs, forged documents, witness statements, financial records, and evidence of Victoria's prior disbarment. But we didn't stop there. Digging deeper into the HOA's finances, we uncovered transactions showing rental income funneling not into the HOA's official accounts but into a private account controlled solely by Victoria. She wasn't just trying to fix the HOA's financial holes, she was skimming money off the top for herself. Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder. "Dad, they underestimated us. We're going to bury them." For the first time in days, I allowed myself a smile. This wasn't going to be a quiet surrender. This was war, and they had no idea who they were up against. The emergency HOA meeting was called 2 days later, and the community center was packed wall to wall with concerned homeowners. Many of them had spent years trusting Victoria without question, believing her promises of raising property values and modernizing the neighborhood. They had no idea how deeply they'd been played. Sarah and I arrived early, armed with every piece of evidence, every document, every photo. We sat front and center, with 2 state investigators seated beside us. When Victoria strode in, dressed in yet another perfectly tailored suit, her confidence visibly wavered for the first time. She scanned the room, expecting allies, but all she found were furrowed brows and whispers of betrayal. Robert, the newly appointed interim HOA president, took the podium. Before we begin, we need to address serious allegations regarding the unauthorized use of the Miller property. Victoria attempted to seize the narrative immediately, her voice dripping with faux concern. The community utilization program was board approved. Everything was done by the book. Frank's sudden resistance is unfortunate, but Margaret, once one of her staunchest supporters, cut her off coldly. We never approved this. You misled us with falsified documents. Victoria's smile faltered. Sarah stood then, calm but commanding, and connected her laptop to the projector. What appeared on the screen wiped the smirk from Victoria's face completely, her California disbarment records under her original name, Victoria Mercer. Gasps rippled through the room as neighbors read the words, fraud, misappropriation of funds, disbarred. Then came the photos of the forged signatures, the fraudulent rental listings, the lavish private parties Victoria had thrown on our property, and finally, the separate bank account where she'd funneled rental profits for personal gain. The room turned on her like a dam breaking. Questions flew, demands shouted, accusations hurled. Robert's voice rose above the chaos. The board unanimously votes to remove Victoria Caldwell from all positions effective immediately. Then he turned to me. Frank, Sarah, on behalf of this entire community, we apologize. What can we do to make this right? I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. First, full reimbursement for every piece of stolen property and damage, over $42,000. Second, every cent of rental income generated from our property is to be transferred to us immediately, and all future bookings cancelled and refunded from HOA accounts, not from homeowners' fees. Third, our property is to be permanently exempt from HOA rules and dues, forever. Lastly, Sarah added, the HOA will create a legal defense fund for any homeowner victimized by HOA abuses moving forward. The vote to accept our terms was unanimous. Victoria didn't even try to argue. As state investigators escorted her out, whispers followed her like shadows. She was later forced to sell her luxury home and now faces criminal prosecution for fraud, forgery, and tax evasion. The new HOA board brought transparency to finances, slashed fees, and earned back the trust of wary homeowners. As for us, we used the settlement money to expand the farm, building better fencing and starting the farm-to-table events we'd always dreamed of. Ironically, it was those very events, honest, authentic, and community-driven, that boosted surrounding property values far more than Victoria's fraudulent schemes ever could. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about protecting what you have. It's about setting things right so others won't fall victim. I never asked for this fight, but I don't regret it for a second. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse. 4-0